Weeding LOG construction set is a work of art that was produced in an edition of 7 copies. It attempts to make visual the 7 US editions of Leaves of Grass that were published in the United States from 1855 to 1892. I first got interested in Walt Whitman by chance through a reference to a poem he wrote called The Dough-Faced Song. A couple months later, when I was giving a lecture at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, I was able to have a long conversation with Angela Lorenz, who was the former director of the library there, and she started telling me about Leaves of Grass in depth. It started out with 12 poems in 1855 that didn't have names, and then it ended up being about 419 poems in 1892. Poems get added, poems get dropped, poems merge, poems divide. The 7 editions are radically different from one another. They'll have the title Leaves of Grass, and people think of it as one book, but it was one work that was worked on for almost 40 years. I thought it would be interesting to try to make that visual. I usually use materials in my work that are symbolically related to the subject matter that I've researched. When I create works of art that embody biographies of authors, visual biographies they're called, I will often use pencils or pencil erasers, office supplies, things related to writers. And I did the same for the Whitman project. With Whitman, he's not only a writer, but he started out as a carpenter, a house builder, apprenticed to his father. So we have materials that relate to building and builders, apart from the fact that this is a construction set. The carpenter pencils that have been drilled to create an erector set and make Walt Whitman's name. The Lincoln log cabins that are created with cedar pencils. I used mason line to bind the roofs of the annexes. The booklet itself is created with Tyvek, a material that happens to be archival, but that's used to wrap houses. I painted the white Tyvek with a yellow color that resembles the cover of the 1881 edition, the Osgood edition, to show his work with Civil War soldiers, mostly Union soldiers, in hospitals and occasionally on the battlefield itself. One of his poems was called The Wound Dresser, for example. I wrapped this wooden box that contains the various elements, all representing the poems from Leaves of Grass, in an ace bandage that keeps the box together. It comes in a bag, which you could also think of as a work bag of sailors. It's made out of a painter's drop cloth, and then the lining of it is a spinnaker sail recycled from a boat in Maine. It makes a wonderful rustling sound when you open the bag, and the drawstrings are from the edging of the spinnaker sail. Inside, you find 5 crepe rubber pegboards that I repurposed from an American game that children use today to help their fine motor skills. And I use it to place garden stakes and clothespins that are painted green and printed that represent every single poem published by Whitman in Leaves of Grass through 1881. The crepe rubber mats are cut into shapes that also are significant. One of them is a geometric butterfly. He was always writing about nature, but there's a famous photograph of him with a butterfly on his finger. People thought the butterfly was real, but it was cardboard. The other ones refer to male and female, bodies together. The human body and sexuality is very much a part of Whitman's Leaves of Grass as well. But the butterfly shows up in different places. I don't like to use antique things in my work or precious things in my work usually. I like to reflect upon it and reproduce it in some way, get some distance from that. But in this case, I have collaged vintage butterflies that are chromolithographs on both the outside and inside cover of the box. I have a wonderful collection of tobacco silks. These were created around 1910, and they are wonderful images of butterflies and moths. They're from Tokyo cigarettes. I use it to make a bookmark for the guidebook that helps you understand how to use this construction set. The index, which are the first pages that you see when you open the book, they're patterned after birch bark. They are actually ripped out of a book that is the complete edition of Leaves of Grass. So there's a list of all of the poems from Leaves of Grass immediately at hand. I think a lot about copyright and intellectual property, and I decided that since I'm buying a new book and just painting the pages and putting it in something else, that I'm not infringing on a copyright. I'm not making a Xerox and then including it in my work. I'm using the actual book, creating an altered book. The second part of the book has blue pages, and these blue pages have the blueprint of how to use the set, what it consists of. It also has a short description at the back, known as a colophon. The reason I ended up making these blue pages happened because of the experience of making this work during the COVID-19 crisis. I live in Italy half the year, and in the spring of 2020, I was stranded in the United States, unable to go back. And I was very concerned about Italy in general. It was one of the first places to be affected by COVID-19. So every day after 12 o'clock, I would go to a website to look at the situation with a series of graphs. The graphics started to remind me of these landscapes, these Asian landscapes. I started making these kinds of landscapes when I was in high school, sort of by accident, cleaning up from printmaking. You loosen the ink, the solvent, and then I would off-roll it onto paper. And I started manipulating this in a way that created these landscapes that I overprinted onto the directions and the descriptions of the LOG construction set. The guide has flaps that are kind of a cheat sheet to let you understand right away what's the intention of the work, a visual guide to the garden stakes and the index printed on the garden stakes. So very few words that people need to read to understand what is this construction set and how to use it. The flaps, visually, they look like the way he cut up scraps and reflect Whitman's way of constantly editing his own work, but I also imitated his handwriting. The cover of the box wasn't initially created for that purpose. I collect ephemera, old boxes and packaging and games. They teach us a lot about society, what people think, who is this product being pitched to, and why, and what does that mean. There's a lot of propaganda and racism, all circulated through different kinds of ephemera. The front label of the box is a watercolor painting of a game called Plasticville, USA. And it says it's built by young America. So it's really perfect for Whitman, who is singing the praises of America and singing every aspect of America he can think of. This construction set, Plasticville, USA, has a picture of a young white boy who it was obviously pitched to. And I painted it and put it in the graphic novel that I created in 2016. And that painting seemed perfect for Leaves of Grass. So without a great deal of work, I was able to, with the help of a graphic artist, Photoshop the title Plasticville, USA into Leaves of Grass. And instead of the town that grows and grows, it's the poem that grows and grows. The inside of the box is another vintage label, and that is this British game that was a precursor to Legos. And once again, this has two white boys on the cover that are engaged in looking at these mini architect's plans and creating their buildings. So when you open the box, you have the guidebook, you have the drawstring bag that has the roof books and the carpenter pencils and the Lincoln log pencils. And then underneath that, you have over 300 garden stakes that are all painted and printed. They look sort of like symbolic leaves of grass. Each garden stake represents one poem in the Leaves of Grass from 1855 to 1881. All of the garden stakes have a rubber stamped index that I carved out of pencil erasers. The indexes are numerical and they range from 2 to 6. So you can tell immediately how many editions that particular poem appeared in. Some poems only appeared in one edition, and other poems, unfortunately, didn't make it to the end. And they have a little cross on them in the year that they died out. Some of the garden stakes are striped, and that's because those poems either split into two or they are fragments that got put together. Sort of like in agriculture, the concept of grafting a piece onto another. And Whitman uses all of these terms relating to branches and leaves and plants, so it seems appropriate. The clothespins represent the very first edition, the famous 1855 edition that Whitman created with 12 poems that don't have titles. Those poems are visible all throughout, so if you create the second edition or the third edition or the fourth edition, you'll be able to see a certain number of garden stakes and then the clothespins. So it's a way to sort of track the original corpus of poetry from Leaves of Grass and then what happens to it throughout the 40 years of publications. He added about 100 poems to that for the 1992 edition. And those poems, he called them the first annex and the second annex, are represented by colored pencils that are hexagonal, and they're made out of cedar, and they have rainbow leads. I sawed them and chiseled them to create Lincoln logs, to make annexes, to make physical buildings, log cabins, and split rail fences. Whitman had a strong connection to Lincoln, and people know his poetry that is connected to Lincoln's life and death. And so having Lincoln logs is a way of underscoring that. And the roof of these cabins are based on cardboard roofs that were created for a British construction set that suggested books as well. So I thought it would be fun to do 2 little indexes explaining what the first annex and the second annex are composed of to place on top of the Lincoln log cabins. Starting in ancient Greece, architecture, both real and imagined, has been used as a device to aid memory. Visual art has the same potential. Seating and Waiting, LOG construction set, is really about the structure of a famous piece of literature. That's exactly what I was thinking of.